Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. If you're in the US, yesterday was Thanksgiving. And do you know what I'm thankful for? That's right, all of my patrons. Thank you so much to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and also to everybody who supports this channel in any way, including watching my videos, suggesting topics, liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. I appreciate all of you so much. Now, this topic that I got assigned today for my patron pick is actually a really interesting one. If you know me, you know that I love these really deep dive rules questions where you get to examine exactly what structure in the comprehensive rules allows a certain mechanic to work. And this is a really interesting one. I'll admit that this is one of the last things that I personally learned and became familiar with, and it's got something, well, a lot more depth than I originally thought that it might. And I'm talking about this sort of card. And in order to motivate some of the discussion that follows, I want everybody to spend a few seconds just taking a look at these two cards and see if you can spot the difference in between the two of them. And I know that at first this might seem like one of those memes where corporate needs you to find the difference between these two cards, but I promise you that there actually is a real substantive difference, something more significant than, for example, the fact that this one lets you look at 7 and this is 6, and this can be any kind of card that you cast and this is only sorceries, and this one has the extra like adding mana at the end of it. There is an actual real life difference in between these two cards as far as the comprehensive rules structure that allows their effects to function. And so in order to see exactly what that might be, let's take a look at the rule that lets you cast spells. So this says that a player can only begin to cast a spell if a rule or effect allows that player to cast it and no rule or effect prohibits that player from casting it. Okay, so normally, let's say that I wanted to cast a spell, let's say a creature spell. So this is a rule that there is in the comprehensive rules, and it says that a player who has priority may cast a creature card from their hand during the main phase while the stack is empty. So this is a rule that allows the player to cast it. So this is the specific rule, even though you probably didn't know it, that lets you cast creature spells. And there is one for like all the different card types. This is the one for instance, and you notice that it takes off the stuff about having to be the main phase and has to be your turn and has to have the stack being empty, because of course that stuff is not applicable to instant spells. But yes, this is the rule that normally allows you to cast spells. Now, if you take another look at our friend Apex of Power, that rule here is basically like all you need. What this card does is it says, until end of turn, you may cast spells from among them. So it's basically modifying the rules of the game with this instruction that you don't have to be playing it from your hand. You can be casting it also from among those 7 cards that you just exiled. So that's kind of interesting. The way that we know that this is how this works is because there's this other rule here that says unless a spell or ability is instructing a player to take an action, which player can take actions is determined by the system of priority. So that means that like unless the spell or abilities is instructing you to take an action, which it's not, it's just saying that you may cast the spells from among them until end of turn. It's setting something up that allows you to take an action. So that specific phrasing is not telling you to take an action at that time. It's setting up a continuous effect. And we'll talk a little bit more about the exact templating behind that a little bit later. But notice that the wording on the Apex of Power is such that timing and priority is still going to be applicable. And so there's this other rule that says that the player can cast instant spells anytime they have priority, and the player can cast non-instant spells in the main phase when they have priority and the stack is empty. So that's it. That is how Apex of Power works. Apex of Power works by you exile the cards, and then Apex of Power has the second thing that gives you an instruction to start a continuous effect that applies to all those cards you just exiled, and it says, okay, I know that the rule that we're using to cast spells normally says you have to be casting it from your hand, but I'm going to give you a break here, and I'm going to let you cast these specific 7 cards out of the exile zone, even though that's not normally how you cast it. But everything else about how you cast those cards is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is we've got this special extra thing that says these 7 cards have the unique permission that lets you cast them from the exile zone instead of like normal. So that's it. That is how Apex of Power functions. But If we take a look at collected conjuring, we can see something a little bit different. Specifically, this rule here says, unless a spell or ability is instructing a player to take an action. This would be an example of a spell or ability that's instructing a player to take an action. It says you may cast up to 2 sorcery cards from among them without paying their mana costs. So that is, there's no like duration on there. It's just an action, and this instruction says that you can cast those spells. So how does that work? Well, it actually works very literally. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about exactly what physically happens, but for now it suffices to just say that we're getting an instruction to cast those spells during the resolution of collected conjuring, and so that's exactly what we do. We're going to cast those 2 spells during the resolution of collected conjuring. It happens in between the part where you exile the top 6 cards of your library and the part where you put the exiled cards that you didn't cast on the bottom of your library in a random order. So that's just one of the instructions that happens when you're casting that spell. Okay, so now let's take another look at these 2 cards, and we're going to notice, you've got the 2 different examples of templating here, like what we just talked about. And so that's the main difference, and that's the difference that I was like alluding to when I said that there was a real substantial difference in between how these cards function. So this one says until end of turn, and because it uses that phrase, it gives you a duration that you are able to cast those cards. That is setting up a continuous effect that acts on those cards, and it modifies the rules of the game so that instead of just being able to cast cards from your hand, you can also cast these specific cards from exile. On the other hand, this card here does not set up a continuous effect. Rather, it has an instruction to perform that action right now. This is something that honestly, if you were to ask me why this is not a continuous effect, I don't have a great answer for that one. Specifically, I don't have a great answer that has like a CR citation attached to it. If somebody has a really good technical explanation for why this templating here indicates that we're dealing with a continuous effect that acts on the cards, whereas this one does not have a continuous effect that acts on the cards the exact same way, it just lasts indefinitely rather than until end of turn, I would be really interested to see that. If someone has something like that in the comments, go ahead and leave it for me. But for now, I think we're just going to have to kind of take it on faith, and maybe not just on faith, but based on your astute knowledge of card templating and Magic the Gathering rules, that if you see a duration like this, that duration indicates that we're dealing with a continuous effect, and that continuous effect lasts for that stated duration. But if you don't see a duration, that means we're not dealing with a continuous effect. We're dealing with an instruction to cast them right away. And then, I guess some people might say, well, Dave, it's obvious if you have a duration that you're dealing with a continuous effect. And if you don't have a duration stated, then you're not dealing with a continuous effect. But that's not actually true. For example, you've got situations like this where we have a continuous effect that causes you to gain control of the creature, and there's again no duration stated, but we just know that if there's no duration stated with a continuous effect, then the default is that the duration is indefinitely. So if somebody could explain to me why this templating change, which to me seems to be very similar to this templating change, actually means that this is not a continuous effect that works the exact same way, just with an unlimited duration. I would be really interested to see that. However, for now, this I am comfortable at least saying that we're dealing with one of those situations where that is how the rules work, and if there is a specific rule in the CR that says that's how it works, I was not able to find it during my research. So, okay, let's talk a little bit more about how this actually does work, because again, this is something that is even confusing beyond when you get past that one specific thing for which I don't really claim to have a great answer. And so let's take a look at what we say here. We're going to exile the top 6 cards of our library, and then we can cast up to 2 sorcery cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from among them without paying their mana cost. So first of all, if an effect specifically instructs or allows a player to cast spells during resolution, which we've established that this in fact is such an effect, then you do so by following the steps in rules, this number here. And so those are the steps that describe, the rules that describe the steps to normally casting a spell, right? So that's what you find in the comprehensive rules here. And so it works exactly the same as if you were normally casting a spell, except that no player receives priority after the spell is cast. And we put that spell, just like how we normally would, on the top of the stack, and the currently resolving spell or ability continues to resolve. So that's kind of interesting, because like the collected conjuring is still resolving at this point, but it's not the top object on the stack anymore. Now, there's no rule that says the thing that's resolving has to always be the top object of the stack, and of course that, if they were to make such a rule, it would be in direct conflict with this rule that we actually do have. So there's no rule that says the top object of the stack is the one that's resolving. That's just how it normally works, but of course there are some exceptions, and this is an exceptional case. So that was one thing that I found it particularly difficult to wrap my own head around personally, but hopefully that explanation is sufficient for you. Then let's see here. The currently resolving spell or ability is going to continue to resolve, and the resolving of that spell or ability might include casting other spells this way, which, of course, the collected conjuring does. No other spells can normally be cast, and no other abilities can normally be activated during resolution. Okay, so if you think about that last part of it, that might be kind of another kind of point of confusion or cause for concern, because specifically the reason I chose collected conjuring is you actually get to cast 2 sorcery cards. And so if you're casting 2 sorcery cards, usually when you have a spell that includes actions that are taken on multiple objects, in most cases each action is processed simultaneously, right? So like if you say something like destroy 2 target creatures, you don't destroy one of the creatures and then destroy the other one. What you actually do is you destroy both of them at the same time, and the 2 creatures would be put into your graveyard at the same time, because of this rule here. In most cases, each action is processed simultaneously. However, it doesn't really make sense to cast 2 spells at the same time, because you would have to put them both on the stack at the same time, which it's not really even clear how that would even work. So for cases like that, if the action cannot be processed simultaneously, it's instead processed considering each affected object individually. App player order is used to make the primary determination of the order of those actions. So that would mean that the player whose turn it is, the active player, does their action first, and then the players in turn order, the non-active players in turn order, do likewise. That is not relevant for the collected conjuring example, because there's only one person who's getting to cast spells. But if they were to make some kind of special card that says something like each player may cast a card from their hand without paying its mana cost, that rule would be applicable to that situation. Secondarily, if the action is taken by multiple objects controlled by the same player, then the player who controls the resolving spell or ability chooses the relative order of those actions. So that's actually kind of interesting and not very intuitive. The collected conjuring player is the person who decides what order that the 2 spells get cast in, not the person who's casting those 2 spells. Now, it just so happens that with collected conjuring, and as far as I'm aware, every other card that does something similar, that happens to be the same person. However, there's no reason why that would have to be the case. So if they were to print some sort of super collected conjuring that says each player may play 2 cards from their hand without paying their mana costs, well, if you had a card like that, then actually the person who controlled the super collected conjuring would be the person who decides what order the 2 spells from each player get cast in, according to this rule here. So that's kind of interesting and not intuitive, which is why I wanted to make sure that I talked about it, because I thought it was really cool. So, okay. Is this the perfect crime? Obviously not, because there's a question mark in the slide's title. But like, is this the perfect crime? What are the limitations that there might be to casting a spell this way? So we're going to go back to the original rule that we had talked about at the very beginning. A player can only begin to cast a spell if a rule or effect allows it, and if no rule or effect prohibits the player from casting it. So let's take a look at a case where like that might come up. So let's say we had our friend Teferi here while we were playing the collected conjuring. Teferi says that each opponent can cast spells only anytime they can cast a sorcery. So that would mean that, with the collected conjuring, it specifically says, you might think we're in the clear here, because it specifically says that you may cast up to 2 sorcery cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from among them without paying their mana cost. So hey, you know what? Teferi says that we can only cast spells anytime that I can cast a sorcery. But hey, this collected conjuring specifically says that I can cast a sorcery. So, no problem, right? And of course, the answer is the fun police stepping in. The term or the phrase anytime you could cast a sorcery actually has a specifically defined rules meaning. And if you see that phrase, then what it means is exactly the same thing as the player has to have priority, and it has to be the main phase of their turn, and the stack has to be empty. So that is what the game sees anytime you get the text, anytime you can cast a sorcery on a card. So actually, this would not be a time that we could cast a sorcery, according to Teferi, because we have an object on the stack, that being collected conjuring. So because we are not in a situation where the player has priority and it's the main phase of their turn and the stack is empty, that would not be possible for you to cast the 2 sorceries with collected conjuring. Even though Teferi says that you can't cast spells except any time that you can cast a sorcery. If you were to think about just the English meaning of those words, you might come up with a different answer from a judge who is going based off of the official CR definition of those words. So that's another thing that I think is kind of counterintuitive. So the reason, by the way, that I'm using this Teferi instead of the more contemporary one would be because back in my day, we had this mechanic called suspend, and it came out in the same block as Teferi did, same set even. And so what does suspend say? It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from the suspended card, and when you remove the last time counter, that's a triggered ability, it says the word win. When you remove the last time counter, then you play it without paying its mana cost. Now that's kind of interesting because, again, we have this situation where we're instructed to cast a spell during the resolution of an ability, and so that means that we're casting the spell right then and there, and so we know how Teferi feels about casting spells during your upkeep, and especially casting spells during the resolution of a triggered ability. And so because of that, again, this Rift Bolt being a sorcery, we would not be able to cast that sorcery off of suspend for the exact same reason. And so, to maybe put things into a little bit more contemporary light here, this is the reason why Teferi, the Time Raveler, which has a passive ability that says each opponent can cast spells only any time they could cast a sorcery, is good against decks, for example, that rely on the Cascade mechanic. Because, again, Cascade says you may cast that card that you exiled without paying its mana cost. And again, this is an instruction to cast the spell that happens during the resolution of the Cascade triggered ability. And so that would mean that because the Teferi says you could cast spells only anytime you could cast a sorcery, that means that you would not be able to cast the spell that you cascaded into because the stack is not empty and because the player who's trying to cast the spell does not have priority. And both of those are things that anytime you could cast a sorcery actually means if you look at the rule that we pulled up in the comprehensive rules back there. So, okay. Another kind of interesting situation involving our friend Teferi, the Time Raveler here, would be with Explore, right? So another thing that we think maybe we should be able to do, if we use the Teferi +1, we could cast this Explore during our opponent's turn, right? So we could, during your upkeep, I'll play an Explore. Great. Now we get to play an additional land this turn, right? So when would we be playing the land? Well, if you take a look at the templating, we can see that it does say this turn. So because there is a specific duration applied to that, that would mean that we're dealing with an Apex of Power type scenario rather than a Collected Conjuring type scenario. And that would mean that we still have to follow the normal rules for playing a land. And so it turns out that one of the rules for playing a land happens to be that a player cannot play a land for any reason if it's not their turn. So again, the fun police are coming and knocking on our door right here. So if we play the Explorer on another player's turn because of this specific rule here, it is not possible to play a land on their turn. So unfortunate, but that's how the breaks go. So here's one more that has to do with Thalia, right? So how does Collected Conjuring work with Thalia? Well, obviously, you could cast the Collected Conjuring with a Thalia out. You just have to pay one more for the Collected Conjuring, so it would cost 3 and a blue and a red instead of just 2. But the more interesting question involved here would be, so like the two sorceries that you're playing without paying their mana costs, do we have to pay one extra for those two? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, you do. The reason is because this says you may cast up to 2 sorcery cards, right? So like literally it says right on the card that we're casting them, right? So with Thalia, it says that it costs 1 more if you want to cast them. So even though we're not paying the mana cost, you still have to pay any additional costs that are imposed on it, and that's what Thalia is. I have some other videos where I kind of talked about that topic, but what this means is that the 2 spells that you cast, being sorcery spells, are both going to cost 1 extra because of Thalia's ability. So that is true even though we're like casting them in a kind of a special way that's kind of outside the normal way that we would be casting those spells. We still are considered to be casting those spells, so you would get prowess triggers off of that too. Same sort of idea behind that. So now we have a kind of an interesting question here, which is, okay, so I didn't know that, so I'll just pay the 2 right now. Okay. Judge, can my opponent pay the 2 mana? Because seems like maybe they wouldn't be able to pay that 2 mana because they would have to tap their islands in order to do that. And tapping their islands would be considered to be activating an activated ability. And if we're activating an activated ability, then you can't normally activate activated abilities during the time when you're resolving a spell, right? So what do you think? Would you be able to like tap your islands for mana during the time when you're resolving this collected Conjuring to pay for this Thalia? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. You're not able to rules lawyer people out of being able to cast their spells this way. If they have the mana, then they are able to pay it if they have the untapped lands. This is the CR backing for that. Activating an activated mana ability, which tapping your islands for blue is, follows the rules for activating any other activated ability with the following exceptions. And this is one of the exceptions. A player may activate an activated mana ability whenever they have priority, which we don't. Remember, we're casting the spell without having priority. Or whenever they're casting a spell that requires a mana payment, so that is what we're doing, so we're good there. Or whenever a rule asks for a mana payment, even if it's in the middle of casting or resolving a spell or activating or resolving an ability. So even though we are, and this is super fun, right? Because we're actually in the middle of casting a spell, which itself is in the process of resolving a spell. So we're actually in the middle of casting a spell and we're in the middle of resolving a spell. But even though, that's the case, we still are able to activate mana abilities because we are casting a spell that requires a mana payment in this case. To cast those spells off Collected Conjuring would require a mana payment because the Thalia imposes an additional cost on them. So that is how that would work. It is, maybe not the perfect crime then, I suppose, because of that specific thing. And so that is all of the like different questions and scenarios that I've prepared for that. Thank you again to all of my patrons. If you have any other questions about how this sort of card effect works, definitely leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to get to all of them. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.